Welcome to a story that will chill you to the bone. Tonight we step inside the twisted world of Jeffrey Dahmer, a man who looked ordinary but hid unthinkable horrors. This is not just a crime story, it's a nightmare that came to life. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. From the outside, his childhood might have appeared unremarkable, even ordinary. His father, Lionel, was a chemist, often consumed by work, while his mother, Joyce, struggled with both physical ailments and mental health issues, prone to bouts of depression and erratic behavior. The household was far from stable, but neighbors and acquaintances would later recall that nothing about the family's exterior life screamed danger or doom. Yet inside young Jeffrey, something unsettling was taking root. Something that would one day grow into one of the most horrifying crime sprees in American history. As a child, Dahmer was described as shy and withdrawn, a boy who often kept to himself. Teachers noted his quiet demeanor, his difficulty making friends, and his strange fascination with the anatomy of animals. While other children played sports or chased each other around the neighborhood, Jeffrey was drawn to something darker. His father, perhaps innocently, introduced him to the process of bleaching and preserving animal bones, showing him how chemistry could strip flesh from skeletons. Lionel thought it was a bonding moment, a way to channel his son's curiosity. He couldn't have known that this would spark an obsession in Jeffrey that went far beyond science. Dahmer began collecting roadkill, dissecting animals in the woods behind his home, and keeping their bones. What might have been dismissed as the curiosity of a boy with a scientific mind was, in fact, the earliest shadow of something monstrous. By his teenage years, Jeffrey had become a loner. Classmates remembered him as awkward, sometimes funny in an unsettling way, often imitating slurred speech or mocking people with strange movements to get laughs. But behind those odd attempts at humor was a young man spiraling deeper into isolation. He began drinking heavily while still in high school, sneaking alcohol into class in hidden containers, numbing something inside him that words could not explain. His grades plummeted, his relationships fractured, and his mind wandered into territories that frightened even him. Dark fantasies began to take shape. Fantasies about control, about power, about having someone completely under his will. In 1978, shortly after his parents' tumultuous divorce, Dahmer committed his first murder. He was just 18 years old. His parents had left him alone in the family home in Bath Township, Ohio. And with the house to himself, his loneliness and fantasies collided with reality. It was that summer when he picked up a young hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Hicks was only 19, a carefree teenager on his way to a rock concert, walking along the road with his thumb outstretched. Dahmer saw him, pulled over, and offered him a ride. Hicks, unsuspecting, accepted. The two returned to Dahmer's house where they drank beer and talked for hours. But when Hicks eventually tried to leave, Dahmer panicked. The thought of being left alone again filled him with dread. He grabbed a dumbbell and struck Hicks from behind, crushing his skull. As the young man fell, Dahmer strangled him with the bar of the weight, ending his life. He later dissected the body, smashing the bones with a sledgehammer, scattering the remains in the woods. It was a brutal, calculated act for someone so young, and it marked the beginning of his descent into murder. Yet after this first killing, Dahmer seemed to retreat. He enrolled in college at Ohio State University, but his drinking consumed him, and he soon dropped out. His father, desperate to straighten him out, pushed him into the Army. For a time, it appeared that structure might save him. Stationed in Germany as a medic, Dahmer functioned adequately, but his alcohol use once again spiraled. Reports from fellow soldiers would later reveal that Dahmer was more than just a troubled drinker. He had begun to act on his dark desires, drugging and assaulting men while they were unconscious. Although unproven at the time, whispers of his disturbing behavior followed him. His service ended prematurely in 1981 when the Army discharged him for his alcoholism. Returning to the United States, Dahmer drifted aimlessly. He lived briefly in Miami before returning to Ohio, where he was arrested for disorderly conduct. His father tried to intervene, placing him with his grandmother in Milwaukee, hoping her influence might bring stability. For a time, Jeffrey seemed to settle into a routine. He lived quietly with her, attended church, and worked various jobs. But beneath the surface, his compulsions grew stronger. He began frequenting gay bars and bathhouses, places where he could seek out companionship, but companionship alone was not enough. Dahmer's fantasies revolved around control and domination, about rendering his partners helpless, ensuring they could never leave him. Soon he began drugging men at these establishments, experimenting with ways to keep them unconscious. Reports of assaults began to surface, but consequences remained limited, with Dahmer often slipping through the cracks of the justice system. By the late 1980s, Dahmer's urges could no longer be contained. In 1987, he killed again, this time taking the life of Stephen Tuomi, a man he met at a bar. They went to a hotel room together, where Dahmer claimed to have blacked out in a drunken stupor. When he awoke, Tuomi was dead, beaten brutally, his chest crushed. Dahmer later confessed that he did not even remember committing the murder, but what followed revealed that his impulses had transformed into rituals. He transported Tuomi's body to his grandmother's house in a suitcase, dismembered it in the basement, and disposed of the remains, keeping certain parts for himself. This act was far more organized than his first murder nearly a decade earlier. It was as if his fantasy world had fully merged with reality, and from this point on, he could not stop. The murders that followed grew increasingly disturbing. Dahmer developed patterns, routines for luring men, drugging them, and then killing them. He would meet victims in bars, malls, or on the street, often offering money to pose for photographs. Once in his control, he would render them unconscious. After luring him to his apartment, he served only a brief sentence in prison, released after less than a year with probation. It was a catastrophic failure of the justice system. Even after being registered as a sex offender, Dahmer was able to continue his crimes almost unchecked. These lenient punishments emboldened him, and his killings escalated. By the late 1980s, Jeffrey Dahmer had become more than a predator. He had become a methodical killer, refining his techniques, exploring new depths of depravity, and constructing a secret world hidden behind locked apartment doors. The seeds planted in his childhood, the fascination with bones, the desire for control, the fear of abandonment had blossomed into a full-grown nightmare. And while the world outside went about its business, unaware of the horror unfolding in a quiet Milwaukee apartment, Dahmer was perfecting his rituals, preparing to claim more victims, and moving closer toward the shocking discovery that would one day reveal the extent of his crimes. By 1988, Jeffrey Dahmer's life had settled into a disturbing duality. On the surface, he appeared to be a quiet, somewhat odd man working menial jobs, living in apartments, and keeping largely to himself. Beneath that fragile exterior, however, his compulsions had evolved into something far darker. The fleeting control he once achieved through the fantasy was no longer enough. His hunger had grown into a relentless cycle of luring, drugging, killing, and preserving. Each victim was not just a person, but a temporary answer to his craving for domination, silence, and permanence. Each encounter brought him closer to perfecting his methods, but it also brought him closer to exposure. His grandmother's home in West Allis, where he lived during the late 1980s, became the site of multiple killings. In September 1988, after his conviction for sexual assault and a short stint in prison, he returned to her house under the pretense of rebuilding his life. But his compulsions surged almost immediately. He lured a young man named Anthony Sears, a 24-year-old aspiring model, back to his grandmother's home. Dahmer drugged and strangled him, later dismembering the body. His murder marked a turning point. For the first time, Dahmer attempted to preserve parts of the body in a lasting way. He saved Sears' skull and genitals, storing them as trophies and objects of possession. To him, these preserved remains were not gruesome evidence, but symbols of permanence, tokens of the control he so desperately wanted. They represented the possibility of holding on to a companion who could never abandon him. The following year, Dahmer moved out of his grandmother's house into his own apartment at the now infamous Oxford Apartments in Milwaukee. This new environment gave him a freedom he had not previously known. No longer under the watchful eye of a relative, he could operate without interference, and his killings escalated dramatically. His apartment, number 213, became a place of horror, a trap where men would enter but almost never leave alive. Neighbors occasionally noticed odd smells, strange noises, or even the sound of a power saw at unusual hours, but few suspected the truth. Dahmer brushed off questions with excuses about spoiled meat or plumbing issues, and most accepted these explanations without pressing further. Between 1989 and 1991, Dahmer killed at a pace that shocked even seasoned investigators once his crimes were finally revealed. His methods became more organized, his rituals more grotesque. He developed a pattern of approaching men at bars, shopping malls, or bus stops, often offering money for photographs or simply companionship. Once inside his apartment, he would ply them with drinks secretly laced with sedatives. Within minutes, they would lose consciousness, and Dahmer would begin his ritual. Strangulation became his preferred method, a silent and intimate way of killing that left him in complete control. After the murders, he experimented with various ways to dispose of bodies. He dismembered them in his bathroom, sometimes boiling the flesh off bones with chemicals, other times dissolving remains in acid. Certain bones he bleached and kept, arranging them with a collector's care. He photographed each stage, creating a macabre catalog of his crimes. These photographs, later found by police, revealed not only the extent of his killings, but the ritualistic precision with which he carried them out. For Dahmer, each murder was not just an act of violence, but part of a twisted fantasy where the victim became a permanent possession, frozen in photographs, skulls, and preserved remains. As his killings mounted, Dahmer's fantasies grew bolder. He began to explore the possibility of creating living zombies, men who would remain alive but under his complete control. To achieve this, he experimented on his victims by drilling holes into their skulls and injecting chemicals like hydrochloric acid or boiling water into their brains. He hoped to induce a state of permanent submission, to create a human being who would never resist or leave him. These attempts were gruesome failures, causing excruciating suffering and death. Yet for Dahmer, they represented the depths of his obsession with dominance and the terror of abandonment that drove him. Despite the protests of the neighbors who insisted the boy was clearly a minor and in distress, the officers escorted Konarak back to Dahmer's apartment. Within hours, the boy was dead, murdered, and dismembered. The missed opportunity to stop Dahmer then and there would later haunt the Milwaukee Police Department and spark outrage around the country. This incident exemplified Dahmer's chilling ability to manipulate authority and society's blind spots regarding marginalized victims. Most of Dahmer's victims were young men of color, many struggling with poverty or estranged from their families. The biases and neglect within the system allowed Dahmer to continue killing unchecked. He chose his victims not only based on opportunity, but also because he knew society would not look too closely if they disappeared. Throughout 1990 and 1991, Dahmer's apartment became a chamber of horrors. By this point, his rituals included not only murder, but also necrophilia and cannibalism. He admitted later that he would consume parts of his victims' flesh, describing it as an attempt to feel that they were truly a part of him forever. He kept skulls and bones in drawers, torsos in vats of acid, and even a human head in his refrigerator. To outsiders, he was a quiet, strange man who mostly kept to himself. To those unfortunate enough to cross his path, he was a predator who transformed his private living space into a factory of death. Despite his escalating crimes, Dahmer still maintained a semblance of a normal routine. He worked at the Ambrosia chocolate factory, often pulling night shifts, and occasionally visited family. He even chatted with neighbors who described him as odd, but not particularly threatening. This eerie duality, the ability to appear ordinary while concealing unimaginable horrors, became one of the most terrifying aspects of his story. It raised unsettling questions about how someone capable of such monstrosities could blend so seamlessly into everyday life. By the summer of 1991, Dahmer's compulsions had reached their peak. His apartment was filled with remains, his refrigerator held body parts, and his fantasies grew darker with each passing day. He was no longer killing out of sudden compulsion, but as part of an established pattern, a ritual he felt powerless to stop. He admitted later that he often felt he was on autopilot, driven by urges that consumed him entirely. Yet at the same time, he understood the enormity of his crimes, meticulously cleaning up after murders, hiding evidence, and calculating how to continue without being caught. The walls of apartment 213 held secrets that could not remain hidden forever. The smell grew worse. The neighbors complained more frequently, and Dahmer himself was spiraling under the weight of his addiction to killing. He drank constantly, using alcohol to numb the shame and fear that occasionally surfaced after his murders. But no matter how deep his remorse or horror at his own actions, the cycle always restarted. The need for control, the obsession with possession, and the terror of loneliness were too powerful. He killed because he could not stop himself, because the darkness had long since overtaken any trace of humanity that remained within him. By mid-1991, Jeffrey Dahmer had killed at least 15 men, each one lured into the false safety of his apartment, each one meeting the same fate of drugging, strangulation, dismemberment, and disposal. His rituals were at their most elaborate, his trophies at their most numerous. Yet with every murder, the risk of discovery grew. He lived on borrowed time, teetering on the edge of exposure, and soon a single mistake would unravel everything. By 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer had become a man trapped within the prison of his own compulsions. The walls of his apartment contained not only the remains of his victims, but the evidence of a life dominated by ritual and obsession. To his neighbors, he was still an odd, quiet tenant who worked at the chocolate factory and kept to himself, but the reality was that his apartment had become a chamber of horror. Skulls were arranged in drawers, acid-filled vats held dissolving torsos, and his refrigerator contained severed heads. His obsession with preservation and control had reached such intensity that even his own sense of reality began to blur. He meticulously planned his evenings. After his factory shifts, often late at night, he would head to bars or prowl the streets, scanning for young men who fit his desired type. Most of his victims were men of color, often marginalized and overlooked, living on the edge of society. Dahmer knew that if they disappeared, the alarm would be slow to sound. He offered money to pose for photographs, a tactic that seemed harmless enough to his targets, but once inside his apartment, the script was always the same. Drinks were spiked, unconsciousness followed, and then strangulation. For Dahmer, the killing was only the beginning. He photographed his victims before and after death, capturing them in staged positions as if they were models for a private, grotesque art project. He spent hours dismembering them, saving bones, bleaching skulls, and arranging them in boxes. Some were kept as trophies, others as reminders of the rituals that fed his obsession. Cannibalism became another extension of his desire to absorb and control. He admitted later to consuming pieces of flesh, convinced it made his victims a permanent part of him. He described it as an act not born of hunger, but of longing, a way to keep those he killed within him forever. The neighbors in the Oxford apartments could not ignore the stench emanating from number 213. They complained repeatedly of the foul odor, a mixture of decomposition and chemicals. Dahmer dismissed their concerns with excuses about spoiled meat or a faulty refrigerator, and most reluctantly accepted these explanations. In reality, the smell came from the acid baths and the rotting remains hidden within. The sound of a power saw at odd hours became another unsettling detail that some recalled later, but at the time it seemed easier to dismiss than confront. Despite the mounting horror inside his home, Dahmer still maintained the facade of normalcy. He chatted with his landlord about repairs, he greeted neighbors in passing, and he showed up at work, though often hungover and distracted. His employer tolerated his lateness and poor performance until eventually firing him in July 1991, but even then, no one suspected the scope of his secret life. The ability to blend into ordinary society while committing extraordinary atrocities was one of the most chilling aspects of his existence. The near escapes that could have ended his reign earlier only deepened the tragedy of his victims. In addition to the case of young Konorak Sinthasamfa, where police returned the boy to Dahmer's apartment, there were other moments when suspicion brushed close but never stuck. On one occasion, a man named Ronald Flowers narrowly survived after Dahmer attempted to drug him. He woke up confused and disoriented, but managed to escape before Dahmer could act further. Other men reported strange experiences with him, but did not go to the police, fearful of stigma or unconvinced that their accounts would be taken seriously. These missed opportunities allowed Dahmer to continue unchallenged, and his murders mounted steadily. In the final months before his capture, Dahmer killed with increasing frequency. The compulsion had become almost unmanageable, driving him to lure men into his apartment week after week. He spoke later of being caught in a cycle he could not control, a cycle where loneliness, alcohol, and fantasy merged into one unstoppable force. Each new victim was not enough. He needed another and then another, as if trying to fill a void that only grew deeper. He described feeling powerless to resist, as though something beyond him had taken hold and would not let go. In July 1991, everything began to unravel. His killings had accelerated to the point where his apartment was overflowing with evidence. The stench grew unbearable, and complaints from neighbors intensified. He lost his job at the chocolate factory, leaving him with more idle time to drink and obsess. His last victims were killed within days of each other, his rituals reaching their most elaborate and deranged. Yet it was in these final days that fate intervened in the form of one man who managed to escape the cycle of death. On the night of July 22, 1991, Dahmer met Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man on the streets of Milwaukee. He offered Edwards money to come back to his apartment for photographs, the same method he had used countless times before. Edwards, perhaps needing the cash or simply willing to take a chance, agreed and accompanied him. Once inside, however, Edwards quickly sensed something was wrong. The smell was overwhelming, and strange boxes and containers filled the apartment. Dahmer attempted to handcuff him, and though he managed to secure one wrist, Edwards resisted fiercely, keeping the other arm free. What followed was a tense psychological battle. Dahmer pulled a knife and threatened Edwards, but Edwards, realizing his only chance was to remain calm, tried to placate him. He spoke softly, attempting to gain Dahmer's trust, telling him he was not going to run, trying to buy time. They sat together in the apartment, the television playing, while Edwards looked for an opening. Dahmer seemed lost between menace and loneliness, alternating between threats and strange attempts at conversation. Eventually, Edwards saw his chance. When Dahmer became distracted, he struck him and fled the apartment, running through the streets with the handcuffs still dangling from his wrist. He flagged down 2 police officers, breathless and terrified, explaining that a man had tried to kill him. At first, the officers thought it was a domestic dispute, but Edwards insisted they follow him back to the apartment. When they arrived, Dahmer was calm, almost eerily so. He told the officers it was all a misunderstanding. But when one officer entered the bedroom to retrieve the key to the handcuffs, he saw the photographs, dozens of them, showing dismembered bodies in various poses. The images were so graphic and real that there was no mistaking them for anything but what they were. The officers shouted for backup, and in that moment, Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror came crashing down. The search of his apartment revealed a nightmare. Investigators found skulls in the refrigerator and freezer, a human head on the bottom shelf, jars containing preserved organs, vats filled with acid and dissolving remains, and countless photographs documenting the horror. It was a crime scene so grotesque that seasoned detectives were shaken to their core. The sheer scale of the evidence made it clear that this was not the work of a man who had killed once or twice, but of a predator who had been at it for years, meticulously recording and preserving his atrocities. The news spread quickly, first through Milwaukee and then across the world. The public was stunned by the revelations, horrified that such evil could exist in the middle of an ordinary city, hidden behind the door of a modest apartment. Reporters crowded the streets, neighbors gave interviews describing their disbelief, and families of the missing suddenly had their worst fears confirmed. For every skull and photograph, there was a family shattered, a loved one who would never come home. Dahmer was arrested and taken into custody, where he quickly confessed to everything. In hours of chilling interviews, he spoke in detail about each of his murders, recounting names, methods, and motives with a calm, almost clinical detachment. He explained his obsession with control, his fear of abandonment, and his attempts to create living zombies. He described his acts of cannibalism without hesitation, as if speaking of something mundane. Investigators were struck by his candor, but also by his lack of apparent remorse. He admitted that he had long known what he was doing was wrong, but felt powerless to stop himself. By the time he finished confessing, the scope of his crimes was undeniable. Between 1978 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer had killed 17 men and boys. The youngest was 14, the oldest in his early 30s. Each had been lured into his trap, stripped of life, and turned into part of a ritual that only Dahmer fully understood. The horror of his actions went beyond the killings themselves, extending into the desecration and consumption of his victims, acts that shocked even those hardened by years of criminal investigation. The trial that followed would become one of the most notorious in modern history, a chilling exploration not only of Dahmer's crimes, but of the darkness within human nature. For the families of the victims, it was a chance to confront the man who had stolen their sons and brothers, to look into the face of the monster who had hidden so effectively in plain sight. For the public, it was an opportunity to try to understand how such evil could exist, and how it had gone undetected for so long. But for Dahmer himself, it was perhaps the only stage left on which he could fully reveal the twisted compulsions that had consumed his life. Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror finally came to an end on the night of July 22, 1991. The man who had eluded justice for so long, slipping through the cracks of a system that had failed his victims time and again, was finally caught not by careful police work, but by a twist of fate. It began when Dahmer lured a young man named Tracy Edwards back to his apartment, promising money if he posed for photographs. This was a tactic Dahmer had perfected over the years, the same routine he had used to ensnare so many others. But this time, something went differently. Inside the apartment, Tracy Edwards immediately sensed the overwhelming stench, the dark, suffocating atmosphere of death that clung to the place. Dahmer, attempting to control the situation, tried to handcuff him. Edwards resisted, but found himself partially restrained with one cuff on his wrist. Dahmer threatened him with a knife, leading him deeper into the apartment where the evidence of his horrors was all around bleach containers, suspicious tools, and the overpowering smell of decay. Edwards knew he had to get out, or he would not survive. By staying calm, he gained Dahmer's trust just enough to wait for a chance. Finally, seizing the moment when Dahmer's guard dropped, Edwards struck, pushing his way past the killer and running out of the apartment in sheer desperation. Panicked, cuffs still hanging from his wrist, Edwards flagged down 2 Milwaukee police officers. He told them about the terrifying ordeal, about the knife, the attempted handcuffing, and the strange behavior of the man inside. The officers followed Edwards back to Dahmer's apartment, not realizing they were about to walk into a chamber of horrors unlike anything they had ever seen. Dahmer greeted them calmly, trying to act casual, but the officers pushed their way in, intent on finding the key to the cuffs. Inside, they were hit by the pungent stench of decomposing flesh. At first glance, the apartment looked oddly tidy, almost ordinary, but as one officer searched the bedroom, he opened a drawer in a bedside dresser and found something that froze him in place: photographs, dozens of them, each one depicting bodies in various stages of mutilation, some dismembered, some posed grotesquely. These were not artistic photographs. They were trophies. They were proof. The officer called out to his partner, and suddenly Dahmer panicked. He lunged, but he was quickly subdued, wrestled to the floor, and handcuffed with his own restraints. The officers radioed for backup, realizing they had stumbled onto something far beyond an attempted assault. As police combed through the apartment, the full extent of Dahmer's crimes unfolded before them. In the refrigerator, they found human heads carefully stored as if they were leftovers. In the freezer, they found packages of flesh wrapped in plastic, labeled and stacked neatly. In a large blue barrel filled with acid, they discovered skeletal remains dissolving slowly into sludge. In filing cabinets, they found bones, skulls, and more photographs, cataloging his gruesome work. The apartment was, quite literally, a house of horrors. Investigators were stunned, struggling to comprehend how such depravity had existed in plain sight. Neighbors who had long complained about the smell were horrified when they learned the truth. What they thought had been spoiled meat or garbage turned out to be the stench of human remains. Jeffrey Dahmer was taken into custody, and over the following days and weeks, the world would learn the scale of his killings. One by one, he confessed to the murders, describing in chilling detail how he had lured men back to his home, drugged them, strangled them, and performed unspeakable acts with their bodies. He admitted to killing 17 young men and boys between 1978 and 1991. His confessions were so detailed, so matter-of-fact, that investigators often struggled to stomach them. Dahmer spoke about how he attempted crude lobotomies, drilling holes into his victims' skulls and pouring chemicals inside, hoping to create compliant, zombie-like companions. He talked about dismemberment, about necrophilia, and even about cannibalism. What shocked people most was not just the brutality of the crimes, but the detached way in which he described them, as if he were recounting everyday events. The public reaction was one of horror and fascination. How could this quiet, unassuming man, who had worked in a chocolate factory and lived in a modest apartment, hide such monstrous behavior for so long? The Milwaukee Police Department came under heavy scrutiny when it was revealed that they had previously had chances to catch him. Most notably, in 1991, one of Dahmer's would-be victims, a 14-year-old boy named Konarak Sinthasumphone, had escaped and was found wandering the streets, drugged and disoriented. Neighbors called police, but when officers arrived, Dahmer convinced them that the boy was his 19-year-old lover, and that it was merely a domestic dispute. Despite protests from bystanders who insisted the boy was in danger, the police returned him to Dahmer's apartment. Shortly after, the boy was murdered. This revelation sparked outrage, highlighting not only police negligence, but also issues of race and sexuality, as many of Dahmer's victims were young men of color, and their disappearances had not been given the same urgency as others. Dahmer's trial began in January 1992. It was one of the most closely followed trials in American history. The courtroom was filled with reporters, family members of the victims, and curious onlookers who wanted to see the man dubbed the Milwaukee Cannibal face justice. Dahmer's defense did not dispute the killings. The evidence was overwhelming, and Dahmer himself had confessed to everything. Instead, his lawyers argued that he was legally insane, driven by uncontrollable impulses and mental illness. The prosecution, however, contended that Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing, that he planned his crimes meticulously, covered them up, and took deliberate steps to avoid detection. The case hinged not on whether he committed the murders, but on whether he could be held fully responsible for them. Throughout the trial, the jury listened to testimony from experts, police officers, and even Dahmer's own family. His father, Lionel Dahmer, spoke about Jeffrey's troubled childhood, his fascination with roadkill, his alcoholism, and the divorce that fractured the family. But the most powerful testimony came from the families of the victims. One by one, they stood before the court, describing the pain, the loss, and the devastation that Dahmer's crimes had inflicted. In one particularly emotional moment, the sister of victim Errol Lindsay erupted in fury, shouting at Dahmer that she hoped he burned in hell. Her raw grief echoed what so many others in the courtroom felt, but could not put into words. In February 1992, after weeks of testimony, the jury reached its verdict. They rejected the insanity defense and found Jeffrey Dahmer legally sane and guilty of 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling 957 years in prison. Later, he would be convicted of a 16th murder in Ohio, adding another life term. Dahmer himself seemed resigned to his fate. He admitted that he deserved punishment, that he could not stop himself from killing, and that prison was the only place he could be kept from hurting others. In some ways, he appeared relieved that it was finally over, that the dark compulsion that had ruled his life had come to an end with his capture. Prison life for Dahmer was not easy. Though he initially kept a low profile, he soon became a target for other inmates. Some prisoners were horrified by his crimes, while others saw him as a twisted celebrity. Reports emerged that Dahmer would mock fellow inmates by shaping his food into body parts or pouring ketchup on it to resemble blood, a grotesque joke that enraged others around him. Despite his notoriety, he sought spiritual guidance, meeting with ministers and even being baptized in prison, though many doubted the sincerity of his newfound faith. He expressed remorse in interviews, stating that he wished he could give the families closure, and that he could not understand why he was driven to kill. Still, for many, his words brought little comfort. The sheer brutality of his crimes overshadowed any attempt at redemption. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer's life came to a violent end. While assigned to a work detail cleaning a bathroom in the prison gym, he and another inmate were attacked by fellow prisoner Christopher Scarver, a man serving a life sentence for murder. Scarver bludgeoned Dahmer to death with a metal bar. Another inmate, Jesse Anderson, was also killed. Dahmer was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The news of his death spread quickly, and reactions were mixed. Some of the victims' families felt relief, believing that justice had finally been served. Others felt robbed of the chance to continue confronting him with the pain he had caused. For the public, it marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. Even decades later, Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes continue to haunt collective memory. Documentaries, films, books, and even dramatized series keep the story alive, each exploring different facets of his life and crimes. Some focus on the failures of the system, others on the psychology of a man who could commit such atrocities. The fascination remains because Dahmer was not an obvious monster. He was quiet, polite, even shy. The kind of man who blended into the background. His story forces society to confront uncomfortable questions about evil, about human darkness, and about how easily horrors can hide behind ordinary faces. The legacy of his crimes lives on through the grief of the families, the lessons learned by law enforcement, and the lingering fear that someone like him could exist again. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer's story is not only about a killer, but about the victims who never came home, about the voices silenced by his cruelty. Their names, Stephen Hicks, Stephen Tuomi, James Doxtator, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Trotter, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Konarak Synthesophone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft are reminders that behind every statistic is a life, a family, a story cut short. As the world looks back on the case, the fascination with Dahmer may never fully fade, but what must endure above all is the memory of the victims. They were young men full of potential, dreams, and futures, stolen by someone who chose to destroy instead of build. That is the true tragedy, the true crime, and the part of the story that must never be forgotten. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share